Chapter 13, begin with John looking across the Mediterranean Sea, toward the city of Ephesus. And as you saw in the previous video, it was the Council of Ephesus, which established the apostolic sees of the empire's church. But something else arose from the Council of Ephesus as well. And that was a new pope. But this pope was different than any pope who had ever come before him. This pope had been prophesied in the New Testament. His name was Pope Sixtus III, or literally, Sixth III. In the previous video, you saw chapter 13 concludes with John's prophecies about the second beast, or kingdom, and that the second beast would be involved with a fraudulent miracle of fire from heaven, and preach the making of icons, which would come to life and speak. And you saw that the infamous mark of the beast came in history, just as John had prophesied, and is still practiced openly, to this very day. And you saw that John concluded his descriptions in chapter 13 with a prophecy about the coming of a succession of 3 monarchs named Six. The third being the famous 666, or 63, as he told his readers to enumerate, not calculate, his reference to 666. And all these things happened in history, precisely as John had prophesied. At the end of the video, we also covered the fact that it was Pope Sixtus III who established the doctrine of church militancy, instituted the Mass of Christmas, and authorized the use of idolatry. And as you also saw, the Counter-Reformation will go so far as to even attempt to publicly and openly lie about the meaning of the name Sixtus, in order to hide this information from the public. Because they know there is something there that really needs to be hidden. And thus, their efforts to do so. In this video, we will begin our unfiltered and uncensored examination of Revelation chapter 14. If you have watched any of the previous videos in this series, you see by now, the Counter-Reformation is not a very honest ideology. They believe that deceiving people in order to promote their religious views is not a sin, but a good management skill, precisely as was taught by John Chrysostom. And they believe that their church's hierarchy with its absolute monarch as its head, should be entitled to rule the world, even if he is the Antichrist, or, perhaps, because he is the Antichrist, which they do not consider to be a problem, either in terms of its effect on the world, or in terms of anyone's salvation, who follows them. Precisely as their canonized saint, Catherine of Siena, also openly declared to the world, and for which she was canonized as a saint. And as perhaps you also see by now, saints, in the system of thinking, were religious people who taught absolute submission to the Roman papacy, even if he was the prophesied Antichrist. Because being both Christ and Antichrist at the same time, was a secret wisdom, taught by the Desert Fathers, as was revealed in the Nag Hammadi library, where they wrote that the beast was secretly wiser than them all. And this submission was what all Christians were required to do, if they wanted to be saved, despite the fact, the apostles in the New Testament taught exactly and precisely the opposite of such thinking. They warned anyone following the system, which would be created by the Roman Empire, would be unconditionally forfeiting their relationship with the real Christ of the Scriptures. And that he would say to them on Judgment Day, "Depart from me, I never knew you." You've seen as a collective group, the Counter-Reformation tend to treat such theological issues as salvation, as completely self-centered. Theology is nothing more than a propaganda war, which has to be won at all costs, even if everyone is damned in the process. They intentionally perpetuate ignorance among Christians, producing multi-million-dollar Hollywood productions that do nothing but completely and intentionally misinform the public. They manipulate their own audiences by insulating them from any information that exposes the falsehoods they are being told. They will deny the real history of things in the past and cover them up with what amounts to nothing but religious fairy tales. They will gaslight anyone who confronts or contradicts them, and then will even resort to efforts at public censorship of relevant historical information, if they can do so, completely rewriting history as though they were writing a fictional novel, not distinguishing in the least between what constitute fact from religious fantasy and delusion. And they carry these very compromised ethics and values into every aspect of society where they have control or influence. When it comes to translation work, They intentionally change tenses, numbers, and expressions to hide information in the Greek text. They will intentionally cite bad translations in English, such as the terms earth and world, to justify their theology. Fully knowing the very terms they are citing in the very same verses they are quoting, does not even exist in the Greek text. Or, at least does not exist, in the way they are intentionally distorting and misrepresenting them. They literally invent entire doctrines out of thin air, such as raptures and tribulations, to hide their own existence in the pages of the book of Revelation. They use transliterated terms, such as the term angel, to completely wholesale insert pagan Greek Nikes into prophecies, to hide what these things really did refer to. They completely and intentionally ignore all historically dated and contexted references to things such as kings, swords and slaves. They obfuscate historically dated social customs, legal procedures and military technology, such as references to post-mortem exposure, or the Roman armor, lyre segmentata. They also intentionally obfuscate the details of historical events they fully know fulfilled the prophecies. And they teach a corrupt moral and ethical system of win at all costs, that makes such corruptions the norm, rather than the violation. In chapter 9, you saw how Jerome himself invented his very own Bible verse to hide John's very clear reference to Apollo, in chapter 9, verse 11, in the Latin Vulgate. The same Roman Apollo, who later became synthesized with the Roman Christ, born on December 25th. You also saw how translators buried the term abyss under the term bottomless pit to hide its allusion to the Roman catacombs. You saw how they changed the name of the scorpion bow to the crossbow to hide John's reference to it in chapter 9. And you saw how English translators intentionally hid the term sulfur under the antiquated term brimstone in chapter 9 to avoid the chapter's identification of the period of history in which gunpowder was introduced. You saw how they intentionally used the wrong term, breastplate, for a very clear reference to lyre segmentata, worn specifically by the Romans. And you saw how they literalized the Greek expression myriads upon myriads into a completely and utterly ridiculous prophecy about a cavalry of 200 million men, requiring more horses than even exist on the entire world since the beginning of history, several times over. You saw in chapter 10 how they translated the Greek word biblaridion into little book, despite the fact it was the origin of the modern term Bible. And you saw how they intentionally buried John's reference to Kronos, who was the deity responsible for Saturnalia and the birth of Apollo on December 25th, which later became Rome's Christmas. You saw in chapter 11, they completely buried John's given time frame of 42 months after the giving of Jerusalem to the Gentiles, which we know happened in 130 AD. And you saw how they buried John's prophetic reference to Christmas in the giving of gifts and greetings of Mary as institutions of the beast. You saw in chapter 12 how they came up with ridiculous cover stories to hide John's prophecy about the migration to the Great Wilderness, also known as the New World. And how they hid the prophetic symbols from the book of Revelation, which were built right into the architecture of Washington, D.C., and tried to pass it off as Masonic esoterica, when the Masons, according to their own sources, actually had nothing to do with it. You saw when we got to chapter 13, they completely hid the connection of John Chrysostom to the prophecy about the coming mouth, despite the fact they literally gave him the name that meant golden mouth. And you saw that they exercised bold-face lying over the name Sixtus III, or aka 63. You saw that they hid the historical origin of the ash mark from the Azazel goat, given at Lent. They hid the Greek word icon behind the word image. And they openly and intentionally lied about the mark being everything on earth but a mark. And now after all this, what do you think you are going to see them hiding in chapter 14? You are about to find out next. As we have done in the previous chapters, we will also do now in chapter 14. Before we can understand what is really being prophesied in the book of Revelation, we have to know what John really actually wrote. And since, as you have seen, you cannot trust Counter-Reformation Church Board translators to tell you the truth about the text, we have to re-examine the text in the original language to see what they left out or intentionally hid in their translations of it. Most of the time, the very thing you see them obviously hiding, is the very thing the original text is really actually prophesying. So in a strange sort of way, their very attempts at evasion, diversion and obfuscation, help clarify what the text was really trying to say. As we had pointed out earlier, these blatant attempts to bury the truth, also help to bring attention to what it is. They obviously would not be hiding things, if there was nothing there to hide. We will be looking at the Textus Receptus text because it forms the basis of the King James translation. The Latin title, Textus Receptus, means the received text, and was so named because it is the majority received text, and is the least controversial and is the most widely accepted New Testament text in all of Christendom. Many scholars still consider it to be the most accurate and reliable text. And because it is the most widely accepted text, and still considered the most reliable by many, that is precisely why we will be using it for our studies. And, by using the Textus Receptus, we can also see what our English translators have been busy hiding from the public in their translations of it, giving us a better sense of where they thought there were serious enough ecclesiastical problems to warrant a textual distortion or evasion in their translation and preaching of it. In the top section, in blue text, you will see the interlinear text word for word from the Greek text. A Greek interlinear is the actual word-for-word translation directly from the Greek text. It allows you to see the literal meaning of the word by word, throughout the original text. It does not conform to English idiom or sentence structure. It simply reproduces the Greek meaning of the word, each word at a time, so you can see what is literally and actually in the text. The areas where a correction is made to the King James translation will be highlighted in red, so they can be easily spotted. Underneath the Textus Receptus, interlinear text on top, the King James Version in black will be shown in the middle. Where there is a correction, or an linguistic update needed, in the King James Version, in comparison to the Greek Textus Receptus, we will highlight that word also in red, so it can be easily seen. And finally, in the bottom section, underneath the King James Version, we will show our corrected or updated retranslation of the Textus Receptus text, in blue. And where we have made corrections or updates to the King James Version, we will highlight those words or sections in red, for easy correlation. In most cases, throughout our studies, when referring back to the text in Revelation, we will show all three texts together, for easy comparison. And now, we will begin our examination of Revelation chapter 14, directly from the Textus Receptus text, used to translate the KJV, and many other official church board translation versions. Verse 1 reads in the KJV, as follows. Quote, "And I looked, and, behold, a Lamb standing on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads." End quote. Above the KJV text, you see the Greek interlinear text from the Textus Receptus. If you look at the interlinear text in blue, you will see the word, lambkin, highlighted in red. As you see from the interlinear text, the word is not the word, lamb, as is highlighted in the KJV text, but the word, lambkin. In Greek, the word lamb is, arain, and the word lambkin, is arneon. Here, we have the word, arneon, which means lambkin. So what is the difference between the word lamb and lambkin? Well, they are both the same kind of animal. But lambkin is a term of endearment. It is a lamb, that is a baby lamb. Whereas a lamb is just a lamb. With the correction, our retranslation of the Textus Receptus reads as follows. Quote, "And I looked and behold, lambkin standing on Mount Zion and with him 144,000, having the name of his Father written upon their foreheads." End quote. Verse 2 in the KJV reads as follows, quote, "And I heard a voice from heaven, as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder, and I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps." End quote. One of the reasons we are doing a retranslation of the text is because KJV and other translators will very frequently select the secondary or tertiary definition for a word and skip over its primary definition. Sometimes selection of that secondary or tertiary definition is motivated by theological evasion, and distorts the meaning of the text. Sometimes it is simply a misguided effort to provide an interpreted meaning to the reader. But if the interpretation is wrong, the resulting translation will be misleading. So in order to get beyond that, we are going directly to the Textus Receptus, and examining what the words and sentence structures look like, directly from the source text. When we come to verse 2, we run into another example where a secondary definition was used. If you will notice in the King James Version, the word voice is repeated over 4 times. The word voice is being translated from the Greek word phone, and that word, which just means sound, not voice. The idea of voice is included in the term, but the primary meaning of the word is just sound. We have covered this translation issue in the KJV in previous chapters, and we are seeing it once again here. So we will change that back to the word sound in our Ray translation. The second issue in the KJV translation is the words harp and harpers. Once again, that is not the primary definition of that word in the Greek text. The 2 words being used to translate the English words harp and harpers comes from the Greek words kitharodos and kitharexo. Kitharexo means to play on a lyre, and the term kitharodos means one who plays on a lyre. Both words refer to a lyre. The use of these terms to refer to a harp is, once again, a secondary definition. It can be applied to a harp, but the primary definition of the word refers to a lyre, as you can see from the reference in the lexicon. A harp is a very large instrument that emerged primarily out of Egypt. It was played in the courts of Pharaoh. A lyre is a much smaller instrument, and it was played in the temple in Israel. And the lyre was also played by King David. So culturally, there is an amazing contrast between a harp from Egypt and a lyre from Israel. The oldest lyre ever found in Israel is called the Megiddo lyre, because it was discovered in Megiddo, in the valley of Jezreel, as you see on your screen. So we will change this word back to the word lyre, and because we do not have an equivalent word for the Koine Greek word for lyre player, we will use the English idiom, lyre musician. And our Ray translation will read like this. Quote, "And I heard a sound out of the sky, like the sound of great waters, and like the sound of great thunder, and I heard the sound of lyre musicians, playing their lyres." End quote. Verse 3 in the KJV reads as follows, quote, "And they sung as it were a new song before the throne, and before the 4 beasts, and the elders, and no man could learn that song but the 144,000, which were redeemed from the earth." End quote. In verse 3, we have 3 corrections that need to be made. The first correction is the KJV selection of the word learn to translate the Greek word manthano. It does mean learn, but it is the kind of learning that has an emphasis on understanding. In order to learn a song, all you have to do is mimic it. You simply repeat the pattern of noise someone else makes, singing. But the Greek word manthano does not mean this. It means to have an understanding of something. And that term is listed in its lexicon definition. The first 5 uses of this Greek word in the New Testament illustrate this meaning. In Matthew chapter 9 verse 13, Christ is rebuking his disciples, and says to them, quote, "But go ye and learn what this means." End quote. Understanding is clearly being meant. In Matthew chapter 11 verse 29, Christ says, quote, "Take my yoke upon you and learn." End quote. Christ clearly meant to have understanding, not simply learn to repeat words. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 32, Christ said, quote, "Now learn the parable of a fig tree." End quote. Christ obviously did not mean to simply learn to repeat the words. He was saying come to understand. The same phrase is repeated in Mark chapter 13, verse 28. And in John chapter 6, verse 45, Christ says, quote, "And they shall all be taught of God. Every man that hath therefore heard, and hath learned of the Father, cometh unto me." End quote. Since in English, you can learn a song, and have absolutely no understanding of what it means, we have to use the word understand rather than simply learn. And when you make that adjustment, the text in Revelation makes infinitely more sense. Because then, the text actually says, it is a song that no one can understand, not a song that no one can learn. In English, anyone can learn a song, if they can repeat the words. But not everyone can understand its meaning, even if they learn to mimic the sounds and words. Understanding is something much deeper, and that is the sense that is meant in this text. The second correction is the English word, redeemed. The Greek word used here to translate the English word, redeem, is agoradzo, and means to go to market, which is the idea of purchasing something. The idea of redeeming something is included in that, as all market transactions would be, for example, but the main idea of agoradzo is to buy something, to purchase it at the market. In modern English, the word redeem sounds like a coupon program like Green Stamps or something, and that is really not the idea in the word. It means to purchase. And the third correction we will make in our retranslation is once again the word earth. As previously explained numerous times, the modern word earth, as in referring to the planet Earth, does not exist anywhere in the book of Revelation, including here. The Greek word is gay and simply means soil, region or land. So we will use the word land to correct that error. And our retranslation from the Textus Receptus reads as follows, quote, "And they sang a new song, in the presence of the throne, and the 4 living creatures, and the elders, and no one was able to understand the song, if it were not for the 144,000, purchased out of the land." End quote. In verse 4, we get to a rather interesting rendition by the KJV. The English text reads as follows, quote, "These are they, which were not defiled with women. For they are virgins. These are they, which follow the Lamb, whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed, from among men, being the firstfruits unto God, and to the Lamb." End quote. What is amazing about the way this text has been translated, is that it is incredibly inaccurate. And the inaccuracy would appear to be another example of intentional bias in corrupting the underlying text. The text, in this example, has been bent and twisted for what appears to be some very misogynistic or obtuse theological purposes. And in doing these misogynistic gymnastics with the Greek text here, they created a linguistic tradition in English forever after that would be completely anatomically incorrect language. And it largely comes from this text in English. We have 5 corrections to make in verse 4. The first correction we have to make is the way the text expresses itself in Greek, versus the way it is expressed in English, in the phrase, not defiled with women. The text says nothing about men defiled with women. In fact, what the KJV has done in its translation, is to completely reverse 180, what the text is saying about defilement. The KJV would have you think this text is talking about men who are not defiled with women, when in fact, if you look at the blue interlinear above, you will see the sentence literally states, quote, "Are they who with women not defile maidens?" End quote. The problem is, that the sentence's perspective has been completely reversed, from what it says. The text says, "These are men who do not defile maidens." In other words, virgins. Not that they are virgins, undefiled by women. In the English expression of the KJV, the ones doing the defiling, are the maidens. And the virgins are the men. But the Greek text says exactly the opposite. The Greek text says, "These men are men who do not defile maidens," or in other words, virgins. The women are the virgins, and the men are the ones who defile them. Not vice versa, as it is translated in the KJV. They literally flipped the script from its original text. They made the men the virgins, and the women the defilers, when in reality it is the women who are the virgins, and men are the ones who defile them. But in this case, John says these men do not. That is the remark he is making about them. They are the ones who do not defile virgins. The Greek word used to express the idea of virgin is the Greek word parthenos, and as you can see from the Greek lexicon, it means maiden, as in, an unmarried daughter. And men are not unmarried daughters. So if you are translating this text to convey to English readers that John said these men were unmarried daughters, you are completely misrepresenting what is in this text. John was not calling these men virgins. And the fact that you switch this gender so you can put the defilement on the women, instead of the men, is utterly ridiculous, and as you will see in the next videos, it completely hides the entire point of his statement, which was to put an exclamation point on chapter 13, verse 18. But you have to ask yourself, what would be so embarrassing to the Anglican Church, that they would completely flip a text from the Greek? You will find out precisely that, when we examine the fulfillment of this text. Suffice it to say here, the KJV has completely flipped this text from the Greek, so we will straighten it back out in our retranslation. The second correction we will need to make, as discussed earlier, is the Greek text is using the word lambkin, not lamb, so we will change that back to lambkin. The third correction we will make is we will change the word redeemed back to purchase, as we did in the previous verse. The fourth correction we will make is the KJV translation of the term first fruits, in the phrase first fruits to God. We are going to clean up that entire sentence, because when you look at the English KJV translation, you see a sentence that has a comma in the middle of it. It reads, quote, "These were redeemed among men, being the first fruits unto God and the Lamb." But if you look at the interlinear text, you see the Greek phrase, anthropos ap arche. The way the KJV translated, anthropos ap arche, was to say, redeemed among men. That was their rendition of anthropos, and then quote, being the first fruits end quote. That was their translation of ap arche. But as you can see in the construction in the sentence in Greek, the two words go together. They modify each other. Any first-year Greek student can tell you, anthropos means human or man, as in mankind. The second word is a word used to describe the start or the beginning of Jewish sacrifices. It is the word ap arche, and is translated as the term first fruits, which is a literal translation of the term. Ap arche literally means first fruits. In the ancient world, this was a well-understood concept, however today, it confuses more than it clarifies. It sounds like it has something to do with fruits. The term refers to the first part of a harvest, which was set aside for sacrifice to God. The term is being used here, by John, to describe the 144,000 martyrs killed in the destruction of Judea by the Romans. And he is referring to them as the first fruits of martyrs. The beginning of the millions of humans that will be slaughtered by Rome. We will translate this term directly into what is meant by the symbolic term. When we make those corrections, our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "These are they, with women do not defile virgins, for they are those who accompany the lambkin wheresoever he leads, purchased out of the first sacrifice of humans, to God and the lambkin." End quote. Verse 5 in the KJV reads as follows, quote, "And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God." End quote. This text in the Greek is accurately reflected in the English, and there are no corrections needed. The Greek word translated as the English word guile means to trick or deceive, so we will use the word deceive instead of the word guile, simply because it is more familiar to modern English. The English word guile is a little bit antiquated, and not really used that much anymore in common language. The expression, quote, "before the throne of God," end quote, is simply to say, to be in the presence of the throne of God, so we will update that expression to current usage. After these minor updates, our retranslation of verse 5 reads as follows. Quote, "And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are faultless in the presence of the throne of God." End quote. Revelation chapter 14, verse 6, in the KJV reads as follows, quote, "And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation, and kindred, and tongue, and people." End quote. In this text we have some major corrections to make. Once again, as previously noted, we are no longer interested in inserting Greek nikes into our eschatology, so we will drop the transliteration of the word angel, and replace it with what it actually means, which is the word messenger. Secondly, the KJV uses the phrase midst of heaven to translate the Greek term mesurenema. Since in English, heaven mostly means the place people go to in the afterlife, rather than sky, and this Greek term means mid-sky, we are going to change that back to what it means, as mid-sky, rather than heaven, to avoid the continued confusion. Thirdly, the KJV uses the phrase everlasting gospel to translate the two words aionios and euangelion. The term aionios is where we get the term eons, as in eons of time. It doesn't really mean forever as it is usually translated into English, but it does refer to a really long time, just as the word eon, as in an eon of time, implies. Vocabulary.com defines an eon of time as quote, a really, really, super long, impossible to measure length of time. End quote. Britannica.com defines an eon of time as quote, eon, long span of geologic time. In formal usage, eons are the longest portions of geologic time. Eras are the second longest. Less formally, eon often refers to a span of 1 billion years. End quote. So in other words, an eon is countless ages, but not necessarily the same thing as forever. A distinction that could be an important one in some cases, so we will translate aionios, not as the word forever, but the English word, eon, that we actually get from that Greek term. The third correction we will make in the KJV translation is the term, gospel, which is translated from the Greek word, euangelizo. As you can see on your screen, the lexicon definition for the Greek word, euangelizo, is to declare, or bring, as in to show, and glad, as in good tidings, or, to preach. In all these definitions, the one that occurs most frequently is, to declare. The somewhat antiquated English word, gospel, comes from the English term, God spell. Since we are not interested in casting spells, we will update that Greek term, in our translation, into what it actually means, which is, to declare. The fourth and fifth corrections we will make in the KJV text, are relatively minor, but still significant, and they have to do with the descriptive list given at the end of the verse. The KJV will translate the term, ethnos, as nation. That is the Greek word we get our current English word, ethnic, as in ethnicities, from. At the time the KJV was being translated, that word did not even exist yet in our English vocabularies, but since it came from this Greek word, and means the same thing this Greek word did, we will update our translation with that word, in this verse. The fifth term is similar in nature. The KJV uses the antiquated English word, tongue, to translate the Greek word, glossa, which just means, language. When English speakers today say the word, tongue, they are referring to the physical organ in the mouth. So we will update that term to language. After we make these 5 corrections to the text, our retranslation of the text as Receptus reads like this, quote, and I saw another messenger, flying in mid-sky, having good news for eons, declaring to the residents of the land, and every kind of ethnicity and tribe and language and people. End quote. You can immediately see, from our retranslation, that John is describing a messenger in the sky, overhead, that brings a message for eons of time, which means a very very long time. And, which also means, John is describing a messenger that is going to be mid-sky, for a very very long time, as well. That subtle change, though subtle, has a huge impact, on what you are now reading in the text, now that it has been cleaned up. You can immediately see, John is referring to a messenger that is going to be there, for quite a while. The KJV text would have you believe that you momentarily see a Greek Nike, flying through heaven, who acts like a television evangelist, and preaches a sermon, described as the everlasting gospel. And it is the gospel, which is everlasting, not the Greek Nike, angel. But the actual text says something quite different. It says this messenger, in the mid-sky, is declaring this message for eons. His declaration is for eons of time. And that's quite a difference, isn't it? Verse 7 in the King James Version reads as follows, quote, saying with a loud voice, fear God, and give glory to him. For the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven, and earth, and the sea, and the fountains of waters." End quote. In verse 7, the KJV text is fairly close to the Greek text, with only one minor clarification found in the expression, quote, "the hour of his judgment is come." End quote. The use of the English word, is, implies the present tense. But the actual Greek text is in the second aorist tense, meaning it has already happened at some point in the past. The clarity, on precisely when this action has really happened, becomes very important in discerning the actual meaning of prophetic material, so we are going to need that clarity. The second change we are going to make in our retranslation is concerning the word translated judgment. It is being translated from the Greek word, krisis. If you look at the lexicon definitions of that term, you can see it is a legal term, and refers to the rendering of a verdict. It means judgment, in the sense of a court or tribunal, rendering a verdict or a decision. When people today hear the expression, the quote, judgment of God, most people think of something bad, that has, or will happen. But actually, the expression the judgment of God, as in the word judgment, here, is a reference to the rendering of a verdict, not what happens afterwards. Which is what most people think of, when they hear that term. So in our retranslation, we are going to use the English legal word, verdict, to help us be clear, on precisely what action, is actually taking place. When we make these changes, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "saying in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory. Because the hour of his verdict came. So worship the maker of the sky and land and sea and fount of water." End quote. Verse 8 in the King James Version reads as follows, quote, "and there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." End quote. We have 4 corrections to make in verse 8. The first is, once again, to finish the translation of the Greek word, angelos, into what it means, as the word, messenger, since we are no longer interested in using it as a fig leaf, to insert Greek nikes, into our eschatology. The second correction is to repeat what we did in the previous verse, with the Greek word, ethnos, into the English word, ethnicities. The third correction is the word, wrath, to translate the Greek word, thumos, which does not mean wrath, but passion. And the fourth correction is the word, fornication, translated from the Greek word, porneia, which refers to prostitution, as in the act of selling sex for money, not simply fornication. After we make these corrections, our retranslation of verse 8 reads as follows, quote, "and another messenger came, in the same way, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the great city, for out of the wine, of the passion of her prostitution, she gave drink to all ethnicities." End quote. Verse 9, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead, or in his hand." End quote. There are 2 corrections we will need to make in verse 9. The first correction is once again, the transliteration of the word angel, instead of its translation, as the word messenger. And the second correction involves the use of the word, image, as the translation of the Greek word, icon, which has been covered in the previous chapter as the origin of the word, icon. And should be translated as, the word that it is. Being icon, not image. After we make those 2 corrections, our retranslation reads like this, quote, "and the third messenger came in the same way, in a great voice saying, If anyone worships the beast or his icon, or receives his mark upon the forehead or upon his hand." End quote. Verse 10, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, and in the presence of the Lamb. End quote. In verse 10, we have 5 corrections to make in the KJV translation. The first correction is the word wrath, translated from the Greek word thumos, and means passion. The second correction is the word indignation, from the Greek word orge, and means abhorrence. The third correction is the word brimstone, which we covered in chapter 9, translated from the Greek word thion, and means sulfur. The fourth correction is the word angels, as previously noted, should be translated messengers, and the fifth correction is the word lamb, which is the word lambkin. After we make these corrections in verse 10, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "Even they will drink from the wine of the passion of God, poured out, undiluted, in the cup of his abhorrence, and they will be tortured, in fire and sulfur, in the presence of the holy messengers, and in the presence of the lambkin." Verse 11, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name." End quote. There are 2 corrections in the KJV text to make in verse 11. The first correction is the phrase forever and ever, translated from the double use of the Greek term, aion, which means an age, not infinity. Our English word, eon, comes directly from this Greek word, as you will see in its etymology. And, we even continue to use the double use of the term in English as an idiomatic expression, brought directly to us from its use in Greek. We still say in English, eons and eons of time. And while eons and eons of time does denote a very very long time, it does not denote forever. While this difference may seem trivial, it is not, because there is a very big difference between eons and eons of time, and the word forever, which is a permanent state. The second correction to make in the KJV, is the use of the English word image, to translate the Greek word, icon. As we have already covered in previous chapters, this Greek word, icon, should be translated as the English word icon, because that is precisely where our English word icon comes from. It comes directly from Greek, from this very word, icon. So that is the term that should be used in its translation. After we make these corrections in the text, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the smoke of their torment goes up into eons and eons of time. And they will not have rest day or night, who worship the beast and his icon, or if they receive his mark." End quote. Verse 12, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "Here is the patience of the saints, here are they that keep the commandments of God, and the faith of Jesus." End quote. In verse 12, we have 3 corrections to make in their translation into English. The first correction is the word patience, taken from the Greek word, hupomone, which means cheerful endurance, not patience. The King James simplified that term into patience, but you can be patient, and have no cheer. The Greek term hupomone, means to cheerfully or hopefully endure. It denotes a mood of optimism and expectation, while you are waiting. So we will change that back to what it states in the Greek text. The second correction, is the use of the English word, saints, translated from the Greek word, hagios, which really only means sacred or holy, not actually the English word saints. The English word saints, comes from Roman Catholicism, and means something entirely different than what you are reading in the Greek text being referred to by the word hagios. John was employing the term in the Old Testament sense of the Hebrew term, ha-kodesh. The Greek term means sacred, so that is what we will translate it as, instead of layering anachronistic Roman Catholic theological references on top of the text, as the King James Version and many other translators intentionally do. And the third correction we will make in the King James translation, is restoring what the translation of the Greek name Jesus referred to in a translation. There is valid debate about whether names should be translated at all, but if you are going to do it, you certainly shouldn't just make up your own translation, you should actually translate it. At the very least. That should be something you would think everyone would very easily agree on. Christ's first name, in the Greek text, was Jesus. But that was the Greek reference to the name Joshua. How do we know this? Because when they translated the Old Testament into Greek, they translated the Hebrew name Joshua into the Greek spelling of Jesus. Jesus referred to Joshua in Greek. So now, if we are translating this word into English, why on earth would we end up with something different than Joshua? We shouldn't. So we will translate this term into English just like it is translated everywhere else in the Bible, as the name Joshua. And after we make these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "Here is the cheerful endurance of the sacred, here they keep the commandments of God and the faith of Joshua." Verse 13, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." End quote. This verse has been translated fairly accurately, and there are no major corrections needed in the text. One minor correction, however, which we have already covered in previous chapters, is concerning the use of the English word heaven, translated from the Greek word ourenos. The English term heaven, in modern usage, denotes the abode of God in the afterlife, and does not include any reference to the sky, whereas the Greek word ourenos referred to both at the same time. In this verse, you can see John's dual use of the term ourenos to mean both the sky and the abode of God in the afterlife, in the same verse. In the first part of the verse, he hears a voice out of the sky, but in the second part of the verse, he refers to the afterlife. So we will correct the translation of ourenos in the first part of the verse, back to the sky, which was where the voice originated from, and leave the second part of the verse accurately referring to the afterlife. When we make this minor correction, our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And I heard a voice out of the sky saying to me, Right, blessed are the dead in the Lord, who will be dying off henceforth. Yes, says the Spirit that will give rest from their labor, but their work will continue hereafter them." End quote. Verse 14, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And I looked, and behold a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle." End quote. In verse 14, there are two corrections that need to be made in the King James translation into English. The first correction is the translation of the word crown, from the Greek word, stephanos. There is actually no need to even translate this word, as the Greek word stephanos is an object which is known in English too, as the word stephanos. A stephanos is the garland wreath, that was made from laurel or olive branches, which was placed on the head of victors in the Olympic Games. Everyone even today, are familiar with these garlands which were called in Greek, stephanos. The name Stephen comes from this Greek word. So we are going to leave that word, precisely as it is in Greek, since it already has a definition and needs no translation. The second correction we will make is concerning the use of the English word sickle. A sickle is a curved blade in the shape of a letter C, used to cut down crops like wheat and a variety of grains. But unfortunately, that is not the term in the Greek. The term in the Greek is drepanon, which is not a sickle, but a gathering hook. It is a tool that is used to harvest grapes. So we will make that second correction at the end of the verse. After we make those corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And I saw and beheld white clouds, and upon the clouds, one sitting, like the Son of Man, having upon his head a golden stephanos and in his hand a sharp gathering hook." End quote. Verse 15, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle, and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap. For the harvest of the earth is ripe." End quote. In verse 15, we have three corrections to make to the English text in the KJV. The first correction is the standard correction we have to continually make concerning the Greek word, angulas, which should be fully translated into English as messenger. The second correction that needs to be made is the use of the English word sickle to translate the Greek word drepanon, which we just covered in the previous verse. And the third correction we need to make is the English word earth, which means the planet, for the Greek word gay, which simply means the soil or the land. After we make these three corrections from the Greek Textus Receptus, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And another messenger came out of the temple, screaming in a great voice to the one sitting upon the clouds, thrust your gathering hook and harvest, for the hour of the harvest has come, and the crops of the land are ripe." End quote. Verse 16, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped." End quote. In verse 16, we have the same standard two corrections that we have been following now throughout the chapter. And while these two corrections are rather mundane and uncontroversial, they continue to have a major impact on how the text reads and what it is actually saying when read in English. As you will see once again, the first correction is the translation of the Greek word drepanon into the English word sickle, which is really the Greek word for gathering hook. And the second correction is the use of the English word earth, indicating the planet Earth, to translate the Greek word gay, which simply means soil or land. After we make these two corrections to the translation, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the one sitting upon the clouds thrust his gathering hook upon the land and harvested the land." End quote. Verse 17, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle." End quote. Like in verse 16, in verse 17, we have repeating corrections that need to be made once again. The first correction is to finish the translation of angelos into English as the word messenger. The second correction is once again to correctly translate the Greek word drepanon into the English word gathering hook, as in previous verses. After we make those two corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "Another messenger came out of the temple in the sky, he also having a sharp gathering hook." End quote. Verse 18, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." End quote. In verse 18, we have four corrections that need to be made to the text. The first correction, as already noted numerous times before, is the use of the transliteration of the Greek word angelos, to cloak another insertion point for Greek nikes. That needs to be removed, and replaced with its real translation, which is the word messenger. The second correction comes with the word power. The Greek word in the New Testament for power is dunamos, and is the origin of our word dynamite. That term is not used here. Instead, the Greek word exousia is used in the text, and that term literally means privilege. It is used most often in the sense of legal authority. Exousia means one who has the legal right or authority to do something. And so using the wrong word there will definitely give the reader the wrong impression about what they are reading. The third correction comes with the repeated use of the English word sickle, to refer to the Greek word drepanon, which means a gathering hook, not a sickle. The fourth correction is the English word earth again, as in a reference to the whole planet Earth. The word is also not in the text, so we do not need it fabricated and inserted into what John wrote, if we want to read what he wrote. The Greek word, once again, used there is gay, and it simply means the soil or the land. So that is what we would like to read. After we make these four corrections to verse 18, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And another messenger came out from the sacrificial altar, having privilege with the fire, and cried out with a great voice, to him having the sharp gathering hook, saying, thrust the sharp gathering hook, and collect the clusters of grapes, of the vine, from the land, for her grapes have ripened." End quote. Verse 19, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God." End quote. In verse 19, we have 5 corrections to make to the KJV, English translation, of the Textus Receptus. The first correction is the standard correction we are having to make in virtually every verse, already covered extensively, concerning the Greek term angelos into the transliterated term angel, to serve as an integration point for Greek nikes, which should be disposed of, and translated into the English word messenger, which is what it means. The second correction is the term sickle, translated from the Greek word drepanon, which should be the term gathering hook. The third correction is the term earth, from the Greek word gay, which means soil or land. The fourth correction is the word winepress, translated from the Greek word lainos, which means the word trough or vat, as in a wine vat. And the fifth correction is the English word wrath, from the Greek word thumos, which should be translated as the word passion. After we make these 5 corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the messenger thrust his gathering hook into the land, and collected the vintage of the great vine of the land into the great vat of the passion of God." End quote. Verse 20, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs." End quote. Now we come to the last verse in the chapter, verse 20. In verse 20, we have 3 corrections to make. The first correction is the word winepress, where the word vat should be. The second correction is the word without, which is cumbersome King James English, to say outside of, so that is what we are going to change that to. And the third correction is the word furlongs, which is not in the text. It was an attempt to translate the Greek word stadion, which is a measurement of distance, into a measurement English-speaking audiences would be more familiar with. The problem is that today, centuries later, no one has any idea what a furlong is. And the original word referred to a measurement of distance called a stade. So we will change that word back into what is actually in the text. After we make these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the vat was trodden outside the city, and blood came out of the vat until the bridle of the horses, from 1,600 stades." End quote. Now that we have gone through every single verse, word by word, directly from the Textus Receptus, and reconstructed the text, we have a clean translation from which to work with. And our textual retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And I looked and behold, a lambkin standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having the name of his father written upon their foreheads. And I heard a sound out of the sky, like the sound of great waters, and like the sound of great thunder, and I heard the sound of lyre musicians, playing their lyres. And they sang a new song, in the presence of the throne, and the 4 living creatures and the elders, and no one was able to understand the song, if it were not for the 144,000, purchased out of the land. These are they, with women who do not defile virgins, for they are those, who accompany the lambkin, wheresoever he leads, purchased out of the human first sacrifice, to God, in the lambkin. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are faultless, in the presence of the throne of God. And I saw another messenger, flying in mid-sky, having good news for eons of time, declaring, to the residents of the land, and every kind of ethnicity, and tribe, and language, and people, saying in a loud voice, Fear God, and give him glory. Because the hour of his verdict came. So worship the Maker of the sky, and land, and sea, and fount of water. And another messenger came, in the same way, saying, Fallen, fallen, is Babylon, the great city, for out of the wine, of the passion, of her prostitution, she gave drink, to all ethnicities. And a third messenger came, in the same way, in a great voice saying, If anyone worships, the beast or his icon, or receives his mark, upon the forehead or upon his hand, even they, will drink from the wine, of the passion of God, poured out undiluted, in the cup of his abhorrence, and they will be tortured, in fire and sulfur, in the presence of the holy messengers, and in the presence of the lambkin. And the smoke of their torment, goes up into eons and eons of time. And they will not have rest, day or night, who worship the beast, and his icon, or if they receive his mark. Here is the cheerful endurance, of the sacred, here they keep the commandments of God, and the faith of Joshua. And I heard a voice, out of the sky, saying to me, Right blessed, are the dead in the Lord, who will be dying off henceforth. Yes, says the Spirit, that will give rest from their labor, but their work, will continue hereafter them. And I saw and beheld white clouds, and upon the clouds, one sitting, like the Son of Man, having upon his head, a golden stephanos, and in his hand, a sharp gathering hook. And another messenger, came out of the temple, yelling in a great voice, to the one sitting upon the clouds, Thrust your gathering hook, and harvest, for the hour of the harvest, has come, and the crops of the land, are ripe. And the one sitting upon the clouds, thrust his gathering hook, upon the land, and harvested the land. Another messenger, came out of the temple in the sky, he also, having a sharp gathering hook. And another messenger, came out from the sacrificial altar, having privilege with the fire, and cried out with a great voice to him, having the sharp gathering hook, saying, Thrust the sharp gathering hook, and collect the clusters of grapes, of the vine from the land, for her grapes, have ripened. And the messenger, thrust his gathering hook, into the land and collected the vintage, of the grapevine of the land, into the great vat, of the passion of God. And the vat was trodden, outside the city, and blood came out of the vat, until the bridle of the horses, from 1,600 states. End quote. As you can see, if you are familiar with Revelation chapter 14, in the King James Version, there are some striking differences between what you will read in the English translation, and what it actually says directly in the Textus Receptus. For example, you will read in the Common Church Board translations such as the King James Version, that God is reaping the whole earth with a sickle. The whole earth is mentioned 7 times, so it is very hard not to see it. But that linguistic image is completely and totally absent in the original text. In fact, the modern concept word earth is never even mentioned, not even a single time, in the original text. And there is no sickle at all. The tool that is mentioned is a small grapevine pruning hook. Not a large tool for broad sweeping strokes, but a small tool for surgical precision in a grapevine. This dramatically changes how the text reads, and what it clearly means. In Common Church Board translations, such as the King James Version, you will read about men who are virgins. But in the original language of the Textus Receptus, you will read about men who do not defile virgins. And why did John even write this text to begin with? What was he pointing out prophetically to his readers? In the Church Board translations, you will read about Greek Nikes flying in the sky preaching the gospel. Yet, they are not actually mentioned a single time in the real text. And what is actually really mentioned hidden behind the transposed references to Greek Nikes remains in the sky for eons of time, and therefore is still there. Isn't that strange? How could that be, if this is all only about the last 7 years, at the end of the world? In Common Church Board translations, this entire chapter is a prophecy about a wine press. But in the original Textus Receptus, it is a prophecy about a wine vat. A vat is a much more specific reference to a particular part of wine production, than simply a generic reference to a wine press. Why cloak this reference to the vat? What is it about the word vat they do not want anyone to see? As you will see in the upcoming videos, there is a lot that has been hidden from the public in the original text. And there are some amazing prophetic truths in Revelation chapter 14 that have been intentionally buried in the language of the original text in the Textus Receptus because of theological bias and censorship in the common translations offered to the public. In the upcoming videos, we will show you exactly what they have been hiding from the public, and why they have been hiding it. In this video, you saw that when you correct the linguistic errors in the standard English translation of Revelation chapter 14, a lot of details have been hidden from the public, and a completely false picture is created concerning John's prophecy. The public is shown the word earth 7 times, and the picture of a grim reaper's sickle, and given the impression John is prophesying something about the whole earth at the end of time. When in fact, while John's prophecy does warn everyone in existence and every single living human being, the prophecy about God's judgment is about a very specific place in a very specific land, and concerns an area no bigger than 1,600 stadia, or approximately 184 miles long. It is a very specific prophecy, concerning a very specific thing. A very specific thing, counter-reformationists would prefer no one ever hear about. In the next video, we will give an analytical overview of Revelation chapter 14, and begin the exegetical treatment of our uncensored translation, directly from the Textus Receptus. You will be amazed at what has been hidden from the public, and from you, in this chapter. Thank you for watching.